How well does Final Fantasy XIV explain its own combat system, its intricacies and mechanics to new players? This is the question I asked myself before making this video. As someone who has put thousands of hours into this game, done most of its content including several Savage tiers on patch and ultimate raids, I think I can confidently say it really doesn't explain much, like at all. Now there are tutorials known as Hall of the Novice that go over some of the basics. They are not mandatory to do, but I'd say they are worth it if you are a complete beginner, especially since they were updated to finally explain something like the different types of markers you will encounter, which will absolutely destroy you if you don't know how to handle them. So yes, it teaches you some basics, sure, but most information you need in order to improve you kinda have to find on your own through external resources. And this is exactly what this guide is for. To share some information and tips that I think are useful for beginners so you can have a better experience with the combat system. So let's get into them. To increase your damage immediately, you first have to know about the two different types of actions that exist in 14. We are not exactly starting off with the most exciting topic, but bear with me here. If you know all about GCDs and OGCDs, feel free to skip this part, but if you don't, then this is kinda the most important section of this video. Actions or your attacks can be split up into global cooldowns or GCDs and off-global cooldowns, mostly referred to as OGCDs. Almost all GCDs have a short recast time which they share with each other. So pressing one of them puts every other GCD on a cooldown too. OGCDs don't share a recast timer with each other. This means that each one of them has their own cooldown that can range from something like 30 seconds to a few minutes. You can tell if a new action is a GCD or OGCD by either just using it, or you can see it in the tooltips too. Physical GCDs are called weapon skills, while magical GCDs are referred to as spells. All off-global cooldowns are called abilities. Now in practice. You want to spam your GCDs as much as possible without delaying them. There is a rule called ABC, which stands for always be casting. Also, you might hear a fellow gamer saying always keep your GCD rolling, meaning the same thing basically. What this is trying to say is that you don't want to delay any GCD ever unless you have to. The more GCDs you manage to get in, the more damage you'll do. Simple enough so far. When it comes to OGCDs, it's the same thing here, except you want to use them while your GCD is on cooldown and not at the same time, to avoid interrupting your global cooldown. So you always use your off-global cooldowns in between your global cooldowns. This is called weaving, and using two OGCDs between GCDs is known as double weaving. GCDs with an average of a 2.5 seconds recast allow for double weaving, while much shorter GCDs only offer a window to do a single weave. Delaying a GCD because an off-global cooldown wasn't weaved in properly or too late is called clipping and causes you to lose damage in most cases, especially if it happens often. Another reason for clipping is usually a bad internet connection. If it bothers you, try a job with a slower GCD speed and see if it improves anything. Triple weaving might be possible without clipping with extremely good ping, but it won't be consistent and isn't recommended at all. This is why you won't find any rotations based on triple weaving, so avoid it as much as you can. To sum up everything I just said, keep your GCDs on cooldown, keep your OGCDs on cooldown without interrupting your GCDs, avoid triple weaving, well, that's kind of it. Oh, and also if you're confused or don't know what to press next, just use any GCD because that's better than doing nothing in most cases, even if you press the wrong one. Before we move on, one last thing. GCDs are affected by skill or spell speed and OGCDs are not. This is all you need to know at this point, because this doesn't really matter until much later when you are trying to follow a strict rotation that works best on a specific GCD speed. You will be getting new gear with new stats constantly while progressing through the story, and higher item level pieces will outperform lower ones with better stats in almost all cases. So frankly, worrying about stats early on is going to be a waste of your time. I'd even go as far and say that they only matter for the currently best gear sets, which are relevant for some endgame content. Openers and rotations show you a recommended order for your skills and abilities to get the most damage out of your job. All of them are built around the current 2-minute burst meta with the goal of prepping and dumping all of your hardest hitting skills into raid buffs, with the assumption that your party members are also using their stuff correctly, of course. As a beginner with a few actions on your hotbar, I don't think it makes much sense to memorize any openers or rotations. Reading your tooltips and understanding what each of your actions do is more than enough for now. But know that they exist and become extremely important later on for doing more damage. I know I said it's kind of overkill to learn rotations early on, but I think using them as reference and trying to apply them to your current actions is a fun way of figuring out how to play a job and understand it better. Players can be resurrected often and quickly during encounters, and dying isn't all that punishing in most content as long as your healers are able and willing to handle it. Duties will take considerably longer because of the added weakness or brink of death debuffs on top of losing resources, which reduce main stats for some time, but it's not the end of the world. More importantly, there is a resurrection immunity that makes you invulnerable for 5 seconds after being resurrected as long as you don't use any action including sprint. A lot of new players don't know about this and proceed to die again instantly after being brought back. So every time you rest, check if you are safe first before doing anything. There are a few types of damage or mechanics that bypass this immunity though, so you might still die in rare cases. Depending on what you play, there are small differences when it comes to positioning between tanks, melees, casters and physical range jobs. Main tanks usually want to point the boss towards north after pulling and stay on their spot unless they have to move to keep boss movement to a minimum in order for melee DPS to hit the positionals, which I'll get into in a sec. Also, there might be some cases where you as the main tank have to actively move the boss out of a danger zone or position it differently to help out your group, but this kind of thing has become so rare in Final Fantasy XIV nowadays, even in harder content, that I'm just gonna mention it as a possibility and move on. Melees have positionals on a few actions that increase damage slightly by hitting an enemy from the rear or flank, which are mentioned in the tooltips. The open part of a target's hitbox indicates the back positional, while the areas between the tip of the arrows and the rear count towards the flank. The favorite spot for any melee DPS to be is the area where the flank and the rear of the target's hitbox meet, because all they have to do is one step to either side to fulfill positional requirements. True North also exists to ignore positionals for a short time in case you are unable to hit them. So-called wall bosses or targets with a full circle hitbox don't have any positional requirements at all, which means you can ignore them completely. Uptime is one of the biggest factors that impacts the amount of damage a player will do. This term refers to the amount of time in which you can damage your target basically. When melees talk about uptime, they mean the amount of time they can stay close to the boss, since most of them need to be in melee range constantly in order to keep their rotation going. Technically, clipping or using a GCD is also a loss of uptime, so it's not exclusive to melees. Casters can also lose uptime if they have to move too much during a mechanic, for example. For melee, staying close as much as you can and trying to get an extra GCD in is called greeding. It's not a bad thing at all, except if you fail it too much. Finding the balance between optimization and safety is one thing that makes a good melee player. But it's also one of the hardest things to learn and only really becomes relevant when serious DPS checks are involved, which is not often, to be honest. So TLDR, greeding is good, it's fun, but don't be selfish and overdo it if you're struggling. Take it at your own pace. Unique to caster movement is Slidecasting, which requires you to move early before the cast finishes. This allows you to move around the arena if needed without interrupting any casts and losing DPS. You can do that because the server registers your cast earlier than shown on the screen and differs very slightly based on ping and connection. Though casters have become a lot more mobile, it's still very relevant in some fights and boosts your DPS considerably. You can place an emote into your hotbar and see exactly where you're safe to move during a cast for practicing. I wouldn't rely on the emote thing too much once you are comfortable though. It might lead to bad habits like focusing too much on your hotbar, I can imagine. So try to get a feel for it instead of hyper-focusing on cast bars and such. Physical range jobs don't have any movement restrictions at all, so keeping uptime isn't really an issue here. The only thing I see a lot of newer ranged players do, including some casters, is staying on the edge of the arena far away from everyone else. Usually this is a smart thing to do in other games, but not really in FF14. Being further away doesn't mean much because AoEs, raid wides and mechanics happen across the entire arena. Some AoEs like horns force you to be close for easier dodging, and the best starting point for most mechanics is usually around the center. Then there's also the risk of missing healing, raid buffs or mitigation, so it's better to stay somewhat close to everyone else whenever you can. New DPS players tend to forget that they also have their own healing and mitigation abilities, which they can use for support or even to save themselves. I'd say good practice is to just use Second Wind or Bloodbath every now and then if you are low in HP, or your mitigation like Feint if there's a raid wide or tank buster. It builds muscle memory and you avoid forgetting about them in case things really do go south. Interesting and sometimes useful to know is how small your own hitbox actually is. The circle that appears when you target yourself is not an indication of your hitbox. You are just a walking pixel at the end of the day, so you can sometimes get away with dodging into impossibly small safe spots. Knowing about AoE snapshotting helps with both keeping uptime and dodging. It's the exact moment the game registers your position and decides if you got hit by something or not. Snapshots usually happen the moment an AoE starts disappearing. If a player stands inside it while the snapshot is happening, they get hit obviously. But this also means that your location only matters when the snapshot happens, meaning you can dodge into most animations like an explosion just fine, because everything that happens after the snapshot doesn't matter anymore. This will give you more freedom to move around and can get you some extra uptime sometimes. Something I just want to mention is that this concept doesn't apply to only AoEs, but also basically everything else too. What I mean is that things like shields, dots, HOTS, or for example enemy cast bars and enmity also snapshot. Let me give you some examples to explain why this matters. When using an action that causes damage over time to your target inside any buff, be it a party member's or your own, the dot's damage will be increased for its entire duration until it expires or gets refreshed, no matter if the initial buff is still running or not. So you can use a dot at the end of a buff window and still get the most damage out of it as long as it snapshots when the buff was still active. This is why you want to refresh your dots early in the current Bard opener. It's a DPS increase for this job because of how snapshotting works. Same for basic tank swapping. The moment a boss starts casting a tank buster, it snapshots and looks onto the player with the highest enmity. This is why you can already safely provoke during the cast and sometimes have to if there's a second part to it after the cast finishes, which then again snapshots and hits the player with the current highest aggro. Objects like moving orbs are weird and can cause some confusion sometimes. Once they start moving, their hitbox isn't actually in the center of the orb like you'd expect, but directly in front of them in the direction they're heading towards. This is another animation delay thing I like to compare to slidecasting, where the animation on screen is behind of what's actually happening. So if you are wondering why an orb hit you without touching you, now you know. Also, when doing a mechanic where you have to take an orb or something similar, walk in front of its path to make sure you catch the hitbox, otherwise the orb might just go straight through you and cause a silly wipe. Next, let's talk about limit breaks. The number of LB bars you get depends on whether you are on a light or a full party. With 4 players you get 1 bar, which increases to 2 bars during major fights like the last dungeon encounter. In a full 8-man group there are always 2 limit bars and they go up to 3 when going up against a boss. Since DPS limit breaks deal a unique type of damage, they aren't influenced by any raid buffs. Try to use them outside of buff windows and not during bursts if possible. That way you can get the extra damage without screwing over your own rotation completely. They cannot crit or direct hit at all, but they are subjected to a damage roll variance. The healer LB frees you go to limit break when the situation is seriously fucked. It heals all party members to max HP while reviving any dead ones without any weakness or brink of death debuffs. It doesn't cleanse any existing debuffs like this from prior deaths though. The other healer LBs are not nearly as strong, so they don't get used much at all in my experience. Tank LBs don't have any cast time and are only used for mitigating damage. Tank LB 2 and 3 can be mandatory in a few fights in order to survive specific raid wides. Melee LBs are used on single targets because they hit the hardest. However, against 2 bosses, caster and ranged LBs are better, with caster LBs slightly winning in terms of raw damage. The composition of 5% buff is something that isn't talked about much, but still important to know about when using the party finder or raiding in general. You receive a 1% buff to your main stats, including vitality for every roll present within your party, stacking up to 5 times. It's basically a passive damage and HP increase for the group. The roles are split into tanks, healers, melees, casters or magical DPS, and fizz range DPS. This only becomes relevant for current 8-man raids where DPS matters, and it does increase the odds of clearing any difficult fights slightly. That's why most groups in Party Finder want to have and go for the 5%. Last thing I want to talk about is that healers are just DPS. In fact, everyone is a DPS. Tanks are handling enmity and mitigation while hitting targets as much as they can, and healers try to keep the party alive while hitting enemies as much as they can. Healers are able to put out serious damage because as you progress, the number of abilities or OGCDs increases, allowing you to keep healing everyone without having to use your GCD heals as much, or at all if both healers know what they are doing. Providing extra damage as a healer whenever you can is actually the smartest thing to do. Not only are you making runs go much faster, but also if enemies die more quickly, you don't have to heal as much, which is a win-win situation. More damage translates into more mitigation, kind of. In content where DPS matters, it's mandatory to do as much damage as you can on the healing roll. In every other content, not really. Especially in low-level content where you don't have most of your abilities, this can be difficult or just impossible depending on a variety of things like gear for example. So don't stress out and take your time until you become comfortable with it. It will naturally get easier with time in higher levels, and keeping everyone alive is your highest priority after all. And that's all I've got for now. I hope I didn't over-explain everything too much. There is a lot more to the combat system I could still go on about, but this should give you a good foundation for most content. And as always, thanks for watching and until next time.